Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Autism Research Forum. Hi, Daniel. See you there. We have 4 panel speakers. Before that, my name is Alvin Ng. I tend to forget to introduce myself most of the time. I like to be incognito, I guess. Anyway, I'm Alvin Ng from Sunway University, and I'll be hosting today's forum on autism research. We have got 4 panel speakers. We have got Professor Peter Mitchell from University of Nottingham, UK. We've got Dr. Marieke De Vries from University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Dr. Lizzy Sheppard from Peter Mitchell from University of Bradford. Used to be from Nottingham. Yeah, it's 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. I'm quite delirious already, so please forgive me. Professor Peter Mitchell from University of Bradford. And then there's Dr. Lizzy Sheppard from University of Nottingham, UK. And our own champion of autism research in Malaysia, Dr. Kartini Ilias from Universiti Teknology MARA. So what we'll be doing today in this forum is I'll be chit-chatting with our panel on their research in autism. And then we'll open up to Q&A, hopefully like within 35 to 40 minutes so that we can interact with the audience. So audience, thank you very much for being here on time. We shall start now. My first question to all of you is this question that I like asking any professionals to do with autism. And this is especially in this Autism Awareness Month. What is the most common misconception about autism that you think should be communicated to the public? Anyone? Shall we start with Professor Peter Mitchell?
Well, I'm happy to speak on that subject, and I'd just like to say Salamat Petang, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. The first conception and the biggest misconception of autism, as far as I'm concerned, is something that arises from the history of autism and the way that autism was first identified and the context in which it was first identified. And as many of us might know, it was identified as a disorder in a clinic in Austria by Asperger. And the context in which he was working was the purpose was to identify people who had problems, perhaps problems that they were born with, and that the source of that problem resides within the individual. And the purpose of this was to figure out what that problem is exactly, what's inside the individual, and what could we do to fix that problem and effectively make that person into a normal person, so to speak. And in one sense, on the face of it, it sounds all quite a noble thing to do, and it makes some kind of intuitive sense. The problem is that it assigns the entire responsibility for the condition to the person who has autism, and it doesn't really take into account the role of development, and it doesn't take into account within the role of development the the experience that somebody with autism has as they engage with society. So if we zoom forward to the present time, what's become quite apparent from recent research is that autistic people are perceived in a rather negative way. And that's not because people necessarily have negative views about autism. Indeed, they might not even know that the person they're communicating with or the person that they're in the company of is autistic. But autistic people display certain kinds of behaviors and have a certain kind of manner, a certain kind of image that could lead other people to have rather a negative view of them. And it and the other thing that we now know is that people tend to misinterpret the signals in the behavior of autistic people. So that in itself is a problem, because it means that autistic people tend to be misperceived and misunderstood. But it's not just a problem in its own right, it's a problem also for the development of autistic people. So if you're somebody who lives with the experience of being misperceived, and in particular perceived negatively and misunderstood, then the upshot of that is that you would tend to find yourself excluded from a lot of society. So, so in summary, I think for me the biggest misconception of autism is one that arises from the original approach to autism that we might say falls within what we might call a medical model of autism, which is that it's to do with a condition that's purely to do with the condition that exists in the individual, and that's something we should try to treat and cure so the person becomes normal. And that sort of distracted us from the actual experience of living with autism, which is to do with how as an autistic person, how your behavior is perceived and misperceived, and how you're misunderstood, and the damaging consequences of that for development. So in other words, society plays a big role in the development of autistic people that's not necessarily to the advantage of the individual with autism. So that, for me, that would be the biggest misconception.
Thank you, Peter. Lizzy, I see you nodding quite a bit there. Would you like to add on?
Yes, well, just I very much concur with Professor Mitchell's point of view, but also I think this kind of ties into another area where I think there's a lot of misconceptions, and that's sort of surrounding the social skills and abilities of autistic people. So you quite often hear it said that autistic people have some kind of deficit in empathy, and that's I think partly arisen through this kind of process that Peter was talking about how they are often misunderstood and misperceived. So autistic people might produce facial expressions in different ways from non-autistic people, or they may react to certain situations in ways that non-autistic people find confusing or unpredictable. And so it might not necessarily be always clear that they are having an empathic response to a particular situation or a particular scenario. And for that reason, it has been suggested, or it's a popular conception, that autistic people don't have empathy. But I think now it's starting to emerge that actually it may just be that they express this in different ways. Another example would be the suggestion that autistic people don't want to be on their own all the time, or don't have friends, or don't want to build relationships. It's something that in psychology is referred to as social motivation. And again, the theory has been put forward that autistic people maybe have some kind of deficit in social motivation. But again, that certainly doesn't concur with a lot of the sort of qualitative research and anecdotal evidence that they do have these wishes. And again, it may be tied into the fact that it's now emerging that autistic people are just certainly non-verbally express themselves in very different ways that non-autistic people really struggle to make sense of.
I was still muted just now. Yeah, and who would like to go next? Marieke, Kartini, you want to zoom and see who wins?
Can I, because I think I can keep it brief, because basically what I think really aligns with what Peter and Lizzy already said, is that I think part of the misconception is that some people might think that people with autism do not have the need, or they do not want, or they do not like social interaction. And I think that's not true. I think there's a broad variety within autism. That's another thing that I think might be a misconception. So I think people with autism do really need and want social interaction, but that they might not always align perfectly well with people without autism. And there's actually many indications that people without autism don't really recognize what people with autism mean, or what they want, or what they need. But also that people without autism are not always open to interacting with people with autism. So if they don't know, of course, it's a different story, and they might misinterpret certain gestures or facial expressions. But even if they do know, then they might also not be that open. They might be accepting autism and think that it's okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would actively try to interact with people with autism. So they're kind of in a double disadvantage, because people without autism might think they don't really want social interaction, and they might also not be open themselves. So people without autism themselves might not be open to interact with people with autism if they, and I think that's not necessarily something they actively think about, but it's something that does happen in daily life, I think, and that makes life even more difficult for people with autism. Yeah.
Are you muted?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So thanks for joining us this afternoon. All right. So I think to wrap up the first session and to add up points into discussion, this insightful discussion, I might be discuss or highlighting another point, but from different point of view or different angle. I might be talking about how basically, or misconceptions about autism from the parents or caretaker point of view. Okay, and looking at the celebration of Autism Awareness Month, that was held in April every year, and most of the places, we can see that it's not only benefit children and adults who are struggling with autism, but it also encourages society, like people, to have more compassionate and educated in understanding about how autism affected the caregivers and the parents as well, and the family dynamic. So I might highlighting one of the main misconceptions about autism. Okay, we might come across or hear that people say that autism is caused by bad parenting, or children with autism or individual with autism just need a better parenting. Okay, so the fact that it's hard enough, being a parent, and definitely it's even harder, being a parent to a child with autism. And in general, of course, poor parenting does not benefit any child at all, and yet it does not cause autism. Okay, because when we see that children with autism, they do not respond to us in a way that typically developing children does. Okay, so many of the parents believe they are failing as a parents. Okay, so this is actually more evident if they have several children and only one of whom is on the spectrum. Okay, so and in order to meet the child's needs, or the individual with ASD needs, parents need to adapt, with the environment in which the child lives. So this may appear unusual to those who are unfamiliar with autism. Okay, so now we can see that the primary focus of the parents or caregiver are more, into assisting the children. And past research has shown that, having child with autism definitely affected, the marriage, the work, the finances, personal relationship, and the list goes on. So we can see that modifications in parenting style may be required to help the children, to cope with the situation. So that's why we come across, or we hear that. Okay, so maybe we come across, or maybe it's happened, or we witness outside there, when we go out, we see the child throw tantrum. Okay, it's may due to the difficulties or the struggles due to the symptoms of autism. But I think public may not really aware about it, as Prof. Peter said, that not all people really aware or know about autism. So I think what happened, most of the people tend to give a kind of look or stare, to the parents, or even there are some group of people that brave enough and just go and warn, the parents, hey, boleh jaga sikit tak? Please take care of your children. It's really disturbing us. Okay, so that's happened in our society. Okay, so I think instead of like giving that judgmental look, there are few ways. The simple ways, or at the least that we can do, is don't simply judge. Okay, so do not pass our judgment on the parent, based on the apparent lack of control, over their children. They also might actually probably suffering and also frustrated, just like the rest of us. Okay, so I think that's wrap up my point for the first round. Okay, thank you.
Right, now, since this is an Autism Research Forum, let's talk research. Let's talk updated research. What are some of the updates you feel the public should know about the current outputs in research on autism? Yeah, anyone would like to go for that? You can do the Malaysian thing, like talilat, laili, tamlong, see who goes first. Have you all learned that? No? Peter? No? Okay, well, we'll have a crash course later on, but anyway, yeah. Who'd like to go first?
I'd like to say something about the history of research into autism, just to contextualize the recent findings. Would that help as a starting point?
That would be great.
In the 1980s, it became very fashionable in research to ask the question, do autistic children, or more broadly, do autistic people lack a theory of mind? And the answer that came out of the research, or the conclusions that were drawn, was that indeed autistic people lack a theory of mind, and that moreover, lacking a theory of mind explains many of the difficulties engaging in the social world that we see in autism. Now, if we were to ask ourselves, what exactly do you mean by lacking a theory of mind, and what's the evidence? What these researchers were looking at were things like, can autistic people make inferences based on signals or clues as to what another person might be thinking? And if they're not so good at doing that, and that's what the evidence suggests, it suggests that they're not so good at doing that. Insofar as they're not so good at doing that, could that explain why they find it so difficult to engage socially? And so conclusions were drawn to that effect. But what those researchers didn't ask is, or at least they didn't ask at the time, is this a two-way problem? In other words, to what degree can ordinary people, typically developing people, make inferences about what's going on in the minds of autistic people? And we now know from recent research, and perhaps Lizzy might want to speak about this in a moment, but we now know from recent research that typically developing people find it extremely difficult and are extremely inaccurate in reading signals in the behavior of autistic people to infer what's going on with them, what they're thinking, and just what they're reacting to and what's going on. So if we were to ask the question, why do autistic people find it difficult to engage socially? In the past, people have said, well, that's because they can't read other people's minds, and that explains it. But we now know that also typically developing people can't read the minds of autistic people. And so there are two, it's not just one dimensional, there are sort of two very strong reasons why autistic people would find it difficult to engage socially. It's not just that they can't understand other people's minds, it's also that other people can't understand their minds. And there's been a fair amount of evidence over the past 10 years that that shed some light on that and that demonstrate that. I don't know if you want to add to that, Lizzy.
Well, I guess maybe I can say a little bit about what we actually did in our study that is relevant to this particular question. And I think our study and the kind of current research has made some methodological advances that have really helped in terms of starting to show these nuances, because I think casting mind back to the 80s, the kind of people, when people think of theory of mind, they think of the false belief task, which is a very contrived task where the child is told essentially a story and has to make some judgments about what a character, a protagonist in the story might do based on their belief. And it was very well designed to address the question it was addressing, but arguably it's quite removed from the way that people may use the kind of mental processes we think of as theory of mind in their daily lives. So what we did in our study was we video recorded people's natural behavior. And this was, they were recorded without their awareness. So of course we had to get ethical approval to be able to do this, but we recorded people's natural behavior as they responded to various scripted events that the researcher enacted in front of them. So they're responding to different things like being told a joke or being kept waiting while the researcher makes her dinner plans or things like this. And we then present these videos that we've recorded to other people to see how well they're able to guess what had happened to that particular person based on their reaction. And we reason that if a person's reaction is linked to their mental state, so in trying to guess what might have happened to that person, it's very likely that observers would infer something about how they're thinking or feeling, and do that to then kind of identify, oh, I think that person's probably just heard a joke or whatever it was. So we use this kind of technique to record both autistic and non-autistic. They were sort of adolescents and young adults. And as Peter's alluded to, we found that non-autistic observers were poorer at identifying what the autistic people were reacting to than the non-autistic people in the videos. So it suggests that they actually do have these difficulties making sense of or inferring what might be going on in the minds of autistic people compared with non-autistic people. And we think that this is actually a task that does, it still has some kind of elements of experimental control in it and involves a bit of acting and things like that. But it is, we think, a lot closer to the kinds of situation in everyday life where you might actually use those theory of mind processes, where you basically see something that's going on and you want to try and get a sense of what the people are thinking about or what they're feeling, in order to kind of make sense of the whole situation and your part in it as well. So obviously that's just one example, and there's other people using lots of other exciting methodologies as well in this kind of area. But I think it kind of shows how current research is taking methodologies in quite different directions, and perhaps allowing us to find out things we wouldn't have been able to do using just a false belief task or something like that.
Thanks, Lizzy. Wow. Never thought of that bit where you make it a two-way thing. I mean, you're so right that when it comes to, I suppose, even the whole diagnosis, right? It's autism spectrum disorders. When there's that term disorder, that people tend to just focus on the person with the disorder, not seeing that on the other side, we may be misreading the disorder as really disordered or problematic, to the point that it's like us versus them. They are the ones who are problematic, like what Peter was saying earlier, and not really checking on the non-autistic people who may also have their own problems in understanding what's going on. Nice one.
There's definitely been a lot of discussion about the actual labels that are used to refer to autistic people, and the term I'm using is autistic people because quite a big study that was done in the UK not so long ago found that the autistic population themselves, the majority of them, not all, but there was a majority preference for that term as opposed to ASD or various other options, or with autism or things like that. So trying to, and I think that is partly obviously because of what you said about how disorder has this kind of connotation that it's very much something within the individual that's at issue, whereas autistic people, it is more of a descriptor rather than suggesting it's some kind of medical condition. But I'm not sure what the thoughts about that are in Malaysia, and I think it may be different across the world in terms of terminology that's used at the moment.
Can I add on to something to that? Because by complete coincidence, I talked to someone with autism, or an autistic person, this week, and from Malaysia, and she said that she couldn't really align with that person first kind of debate. She said, I speak 3 languages. I speak Bahasa Malaysia, I speak Mandarin, I speak English, and in each language, the order of person with autism or autistic person is very different. In Dutch, where I'm from, the Netherlands, it's also different. So it's kind of and this study you're referring to, Lizzy, is done in the UK, so it really refers to the English language, obviously. And I think it might be slightly different. I'm aware of a Dutch study where actually the outcome was that there was a lot of variety, and some people prefer to be called a person with autism, and other people prefer to be called autistic person. So it's quite, I think it's an interesting debate, and I thought this outcome also showed, well, actually, particularly that there's so much individual differences in, between autistic people or people with autism. And I think we should definitely align with what people prefer to be called if you talk about someone. But I thought the whole language thing, it never really occurred to me that it's so different if you speak 3 languages, like a lot of people in Malaysia do, and then that order of words might be completely different, just dependent on the language alone already.
Project in itself.
yeah, exactly. Quite interesting, actually. Yeah. Can I add on a bit about my own recent research?
Yes,
it's a lot briefer, I think. But I've done together with Dr. Hui Min from USM, University Science Malaysia and Penang. We've done a study, and we looked at 4 universities in Malaysia, and how whether students, we just asked a lot of students whether they had autism, thought they had autism, or didn't have autism. And well, whether they were officially diagnosed, or whether they thought they had autism, or whether they didn't have autism. We used the autism quotient to measure autism traits, and we looked at quality of life, among some other things. But I think that's relevant for now. And what we found is that 2.8% of that population, we had 2,700 participants, 2.8% indicated that they thought they had autism, but only 0.3% actually had a diagnosis. And between those two groups, there was not a difference in autism quotient scores. So they had similar amounts of autistic traits. But what we did found is that the group that thought they had autism but that weren't diagnosed had a lower quality of life. And I thought that's quite relevant because it indicates that, a diagnosis might actually help. It might lead to getting the support that someone needs. It might lead to recognizing why you might encounter any difficulties. so it might really help. But I also thought it relates to, well, actually it means we need more support for people with autism or autistic people at universities. And that's a tricky thing, I think, because if a lot of people are not diagnosed, then it's quite difficult to offer support. If they might not be aware, or if they don't have a diagnosis, that it might be a bit difficult to actually offer them support, obviously. But it also means that other people might not be aware. And one of the other things that actually a study that Lizzy and myself did a couple of years ago, where we looked, amongst other things, whether students were willing to interact with people with autism. It showed that people who knew more about autism and had more knowledge and had more experience with other people with autism would be much more willing to interact with autistic people. And that means that it's actually particularly, I mean, everywhere, I think, but particularly at universities, quite relevant if students are aware of what autism is, because they might be much more open to interact and offer support, and that might make life of autistic university students a lot easier, whether they are diagnosed or not. It might just help if there's more knowledge and understanding, and also about, I think, the role that people without autism play when they interact with autistic people. That's basically what
it's a tricky thing, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, if it's pretty tricky if you want to disclose a diagnosis of autism, and if you're unsure if you're going to get the support, then it's going to be a difficult thing.
Yeah, and whether you want to disclose it or not, and who you would want to disclose it to, and there might still be a lot of stigma, I think. So yeah, it's a tricky choice, I think, for sure. Yeah.
Because I think even if you take away the word disorder, I mean, it's been so much associated. I mean, the word diagnosis itself already presupposes a kind of disorder, and therefore you still have the stigma. Yeah, I mean, any studies to look into how we educate the public. I mean, this whole month is about autism awareness. I think a lot of people have been pretty cynical already that yes, we are aware, but what's next? And then we have got this whole movement of autism acceptance, which does also become quite tricky, because what are we accepting? What are we looking for? And that's where I suppose, you know, research is very important to be shared with the public. All right, Kartini's gone off video because she's having some internet problems. Kartini, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, it's quite lagging on my side. Yeah. All right, but I hope that you can hear me clearly. So
yeah, now you're clear. You said that you wanted to share some slides.
Yes.
Okay,
All
yeah,
right,
feel free to share.
Go and share first. Okay, now can you see my slides? Let me make it into slideshow. It's only a simple, very brief slide, but I think I'm a kind that need to have this structured kind of thing to make my thoughts, flow.
No problem.
All right. Okay. Let me make it into the slideshow first. Okay. So I think all the three panels were talking about their research, and they are basically related directly with the individual with autism. And my research area, I'm working more with the parents, okay, and also caretaker of children with autism. So for today's research sharing, I'll be sharing with all of you one of my study that have been conducted previously, okay, and have been published in Frontiers in Psychology. So, entitled The Risk and Resilience Among Mothers and Fathers of Primary School Age Children with ASD in Malaysia, a qualitative constructive grounded theory approach. So it's open access if any one of you would like to have a look at the article. And this article as well, this research as well, have been featured in Asia Research News in 2020. Right. So in this study, actually, we would like to understand about more about the parents' experiences, stress and also well-being, raising children with ASD, as well as how basically they develop resilience in the Malaysian context. And having to say that ASD, have been the subject of a large and growing area in research in Western country. Yet, there are still kind of research that explore these subject matters in non-Western countries, including Malaysia. And despite, there is a growing body of literature on the psychosocial well-being and resilience of parents of children with ASD, the risk and protective processes, have yet to be explored extensively in a collectivistic culture such as Malaysia. And given the fact that traditions, beliefs, and values are part of the cultural piece that could influence and also shape how the families of a child with ASD perceive their life experiences and also challenges, of raising child with ASD. So all these factors, the cultural factors are likely to play a role in coping and also resilience. So using a constructive grounded theory approach, we interviewed 22 parents of children with ASD, including 30 mothers and also 9 fathers. We also interviewed the professional key informants, as part of triangulation of the findings. And from the results, it's illustrated 4 main themes, like initial reaction to the child of ASD symptoms and diagnoses, how basically the family life affected by a child with ASD, the awareness about ASD in Malaysia, and coping strategies and also well-being and becoming resilient. So the first 3 themes actually revolve around the stress and adversity and also adaptability and acceptance of the parents, where these processes actually illustrated the risk experienced by the parents of children with ASD in Malaysia. And the last themes especially highlighted the strengths and also determination of the parents, and also illustrated, the protective experience and also processes that help parents, to develop and also enhance their resilience. Okay, so I would like to bring your attention to overall the overall finding. This is actually more explanation about the gist of the themes, but I would like to draw your attention about overall findings in this study actually has motivated as the initial development of the theoretical model of resilience, okay, where it's being described as the transformative experience throughout the process of the resilient development, okay. Okay, and if you look here, the figure basically it's described about the path to resilience, which includes the stress and also the adversities encountered, and the sources of stress could come from the variety sources, which including the individuals, family members, and also the community and also society. And because ASD is a lifelong condition, so having child with ASD, it can have a huge and also profound consequences. And over the time, parents eventually learn to accept and also to adapt with their situation, and accepting the unchangeable circumstances actually allow parents to change, their cognition to adapt to the stressful situation. So this concept of stress and adversity and also acceptance and adaptability is best described as a risk experiences that shared by parents of children with ASD that interact in the process of resilience development. Okay, and if you look moving forward, the strengths and determination is another notion actually that emerged from the findings and adds to this theoretical resilience model development. And this notion is described as the protective experiences of the parents. And concerning the various coping strategies, it actually enables parents to deal with the stress and also have a greater sense of control over their lives. And there are a combination of factors at various levels that are associated with resilient development. And having to set together the risk and protective experiences are viewed as a dynamic and also synergistic mechanism rather than linear. And at this point, I think the element, it also important to note, that culture can also influence and have impact on the resilient development process. Okay, so it's about how parents communicate and also deal with the stress and adversities that might be influenced by the cultural differences. And the findings in the current study actually postulated that the resilience of parents of children with ASD in the Malaysian context is best understood as a dynamic interplay between the risk and protective experience of the parents. And the process of resilience actually necessitates, the functioning of many interacting systems within and also around parents and operating at different levels. Okay, and these risks and also protective experience blend together is resulting in a transformative growth for the parents. Okay, so this is basically the previous research that I've been working on, but moving forward now we have a few projects that going on, but as my focus, as I say, is more on the parents. So we have a pre-project looking at the mental health literacy of the parents with ASD children and so on. Okay, so I think that some sharing of my research updates. So I think.
Thank you very much, Kartini. Yeah, it's a great sharing there, because most of the time when it comes to autism research, we tend to focus on the individual with autism, and sometimes we do forget that they live within a system that itself would need resilience, because yeah, I mean, family is the one that provides that I guess the primary social support. Yeah, great. I mean, lots to be done, isn't it? All right. Yeah, I'm just blown away by all the research, so please bear with me going, wow. Okay. I've got a question though, when it comes to research also. We had a forum earlier this month on autism, whether or not to what's that word? To disclose or not to disclose. And we had a very nice discussion about how autism may be displayed differently between genders. So I would like to ask the panel, what are some of the recent findings when it comes to gender differences in autism? If you know of any, just curious. No?
I could potentially say something about this. So it's not something that we have done research on ourselves, but I think one of the really interesting things that has come up in relation to gender differences is this idea of autism camouflaging or masking, which is, for anybody who's not aware of this, it's a sort of phenomenon where an autistic person goes to some level of effort to try and conceal their autistic features. It may be that they just try to sort of mute them. In some cases, it's been described more as trying to present as a different kind of person. And this actually, I think now it's thought that like many autistic people do this on occasion, and there may be variability between people to what extent they do it. But the awareness of this phenomenon came about because it appears to be, or at least initially appeared to be, particularly commonly used by autistic females. And there's been some suggestion that this might have contributed to the fact that girls, women have been traditionally probably quite underdiagnosed. So there's kind of very, very big gender difference in the reported prevalence. And now research is starting to suggest that actually this might be partly because women are just failing to be diagnosed, and there might actually be a lot more autistic women than we realized. They're getting diagnosed later as well, much more likely to be diagnosed when they're older. And yes, this particular phenomenon of camouflaging is may also contribute to it. But it's very interesting. We find it very interesting because, again, it suggests a kind of real desire to present in a certain way. It suggests an awareness of what other people are thinking about you and trying an attempt to manipulate or change that. And none of that fits very well with this notion of autistic people as being socially disinterested or not caring or not having an awareness of what other people think. So it's a very interesting, but also quite a troubling form of behaviour, because then it's now also being shown that it's associated with mental health issues. So it seems to be this kind of effort to try and hide your autistic self does seem to be associated with a lot of stress and anxiety, and it's a very tiring process, I think. So it can lead to things like autistic burnout, which they're talking about now. So it's not necessarily a good thing, but it is a very interesting thing, and I think it says quite a lot about the social abilities of autistic people that try to do that.
Yeah, fascinating. It sounds like there's also a lot of self-stigma that's going on there. And of course, we know that's not so good for mental health. There's tremendous pressure to fit in. And that's something that we see quite a bit, isn't it? Quite a bit of in the college and university setting. It becomes quite complicated when, it's a very dynamic thing. Both sides are trying, and yet, yeah, and that's where I suppose the misconceptions, the stigma, and even prejudice come in. And it's a difficult thing.
Yeah, I mean, young people, nobody really wants to be different from the majority or different from the crowd in any way at certain ages, I think. So it is, it's not exclusive to autistic people, but obviously something like autism, which is perhaps stigmatized or seen as not socially desirable, could be would make life pretty tricky at that kind of age, when you're just trying to establish your identity and fit in and be part of the bigger group. So you can see why it happens, for sure.
All right. Okay. Wow. I'm aware of the time. It's Marieke, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I can add on a little bit about that. I think camouflaging is quite an interesting topic as well. And I think part of the reason why more men are diagnosed with autism than women, or more boys than girls, is also that I think, like, historically, all our knowledge is based more on children and more on males. So that means that the information that we have is based on a particular subgroup, actually. So that might also partly explain the difference. But also, so my master's student, Justine Ching, she did a study about the relationship between masculinity and femininity and camouflaging in a general population sample, with the idea that maybe if it's more common, camouflaging among women, then maybe it's also linked to femininity. But the outcome of that study was actually a lot more complicated than that. This was a general population sample, of course, actually mostly student sample. Because actually what was shown is that self-reported masculinity and femininity were related to more camouflaging. So both, actually. And autistic traits, in essence, were also related to more camouflaging, which kind of makes sense, because if you don't have autistic traits, you cannot really camouflage them that well. And also she showed that actually, I mean, if you think about, it's a bit of an old-fashioned theory by now, I think, but the extreme male brain theory, the idea that autistic people may have a more of a masculine brain. So she looked into that as well, because it's really not so much based on femininity or masculinity. So she wants to make that connection. And she showed that actually lower masculine traits were related to more autistic traits in a general population sample here in Asia. And we partly expected that, I mean, a lot of the findings are from Western countries, obviously, and we were quite curious whether things like, I mean, femininity and masculinity is quite influenced by culture, what's considered masculine behavior, what's considered feminine behavior. And apparently, well, that extreme male brain theory didn't really align, at least not here in Malaysia. And it didn't really generalize to femininity and masculinity. So I think that's quite an interesting given as well. So it means that femininity, masculinity, and also culture might influence autistic traits and camouflaging as well.
Wow, sounds like something Dr. Strange can explain better. It's multi-dimensional.
Yeah.
Yeah, really complicated stuff. Wow.
If I may add some points to that. I think
sure.
I read a few research as well, you know, like they said that it could be due to the early socialization as well, you know, of boys and girls. So the explain from the gender stereotypes, you know, that dictates girls are better communicating, you know, and socializing, and also the expectation that boys are, you know, to be more louder and also more aggressive in a way. How these two sexes develop, but still, I think a lot of research needs to be done, and also in this area, and it's interesting indeed. You know, maybe there is a differences, but are likely to be small. Okay, so some thoughts from me on that matter.
Okay, Peter, what about you? Do you have any comments about gender?
I think it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? If I could just share a story. About 30 years ago, it was so long ago, it's in the days when I worked at University of Birmingham. And I went for lunch with a friend of mine, an academic friend who sort of had philosophical training. He was more of a philosopher than a psychologist. And over lunch, we discussed this very question. And the question I put to him I said, in your opinion, from your experience, I said, do you think there are many more autistic males than there are autistic females? And he replied, just based on his own intuition, not based on research, but he replied immediately by saying, he said, I think there are just as many autistic females as males, except females are better at hiding it. And following that, I was so intrigued by that answer, because people in those days didn't talk about camouflaging or anything like that. And I was so intrigued by his answer that afternoon I went to speak to a colleague who had, in my view, a good clinical understanding of autism. And I said to her, do you think there are actually lots of autistic females around, but they're just good at hiding it? And she said to me, well, definitely not, because if they had enough insight to hide it, then that would not be compatible with having autism. But what we've heard from today's discussion and from the research that's been carried out more recently is that autistic people clearly do have a great deal of self-insight, and moreover use that insight to manage their reputation. In other words, in how they're perceived by other people. And so this suggestion that, well, you know, if you were sufficiently cognizant or sufficiently sentient, that you'd be able to manage your own behavior to give an impression of the kind of person that you are. Well, if you could do all of that, clearly you couldn't possibly be autistic. Well, we now know that's just not true. We know that that's not true. And I think all this leads to a broader and fascinating question about how people perceive themselves and about how people perceive each other. So earlier in this session, we were talking about how the challenges that autistic people face when they're trying to perceive other people and trying to interpret other people's behavior. And that the converse is true as well, that typical people have difficulty interpreting signals in the behavior of autistic people and perceiving them. But the other question that we're touching on now is about how do people perceive themselves? And in the past, it's been assumed that autistic people have very little insight into themselves. But we know from recent research that that's just not true. Autistic people have quite remarkable self-insights. One piece of research that I've been involved in recently, it hasn't been published, it's just something that was done with a project student, was involved asking autistic people to rate themselves on how good or how skillful they were at empathizing or understanding other people. And the findings were absolutely clear that autistic people were declaring, well, I'm just not very good at that. But in declaring that they're not very good at it, that did not correspond with their actual accuracy when it came to perceiving other people. So what we see in autism is people do have self-insights, but they probably tend to perceive them. They probably tend to underestimate themselves, and I think that's a relevant factor as well to autism. Could I just say one other thing? Sorry, I don't mean to talk too much, but this is just in relation to a question that appeared in the chat. Oh, it's not a question, but it's a comment. And one item in the chat is about Simon Baron-Cohen saying that we should label autism as autism spectrum condition, and that this is more inclusive than saying autism spectrum disorder. I'm sure it was done with good intentions. It was done with the intention of being more inclusive. However, to say autism spectrum condition, the trouble with that, of course, is that it implies that the problem resides with a condition that the individual has. It doesn't recognize or acknowledge that the kind of experience that autistic people have is not just to do with their condition, it's to do with how they're perceived and treated by society as well.
Oh, that's pretty profound. I mean, it has to be a two-way, isn't it? Otherwise, why would there be such term as rehabilitation? Because that's it's not within the clinic, it's within society. And even with the term rehabilitation, I mean, what we've been discussing so far, it sounds like, previously it's been just one way, but, it's quite clear that we need to have a two-way. It wouldn't be called a rehabilitation, but it's two-way, getting to know each other and to grow together. So it seems like the current research have been moving in that kind of direction. From what I'm hearing from you, I think that's quite refreshing, and it would be nice to have more of such research, especially in this area, this region of Asia also. Okay, well, I'm mindful of the time. It's 2 minutes to 6, and it's supposed to end already. Partly also because we want to allow those who are going back to their hometowns for the Eid festival, Hari Raya. But at the same time, I would like to also at least take a couple of questions from the audience. Kartini, is that okay for you if you don't mind delaying a bit?
Yeah, should be okay.
All right. Yes, so let's open up to the floor for Q&A. This is quite a rare opportunity, actually, with all these experts. Not easy to get them.
Hello.
Hello, yes.
Yes, this is Yuja. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm quite interested about today's topic, and I don't have any background working with them, but I do attending some meetings or some occasions able to meeting with people with autism. I also noticed that today's topic was mainly focused on the high functioning autism, which is only the social isolation, lack of response, or lack of theory of mind, or or difficult to engage socially. But what about those who are low functioning, such as those kids are biting themselves, knocking their head, and rigid and repetitive behaviors, and they couldn't verbally, or they couldn't write, they couldn't read, and they have language deficit, and also they have a food intake issues. And I heard about some parents saying that they see the ghost. I guess that's hallucinations. I don't know what is that. So any research about those who are in a low functioning autism? And is it possible they can be recovered? Because there's one, I don't know about them, but I know that the founder of the Sunrise program in United States, I'm not so sure if you heard about him, but he have the whole videos about how the child who's growing up, about biting himself, those kind of tantrums. Well, now he's really high functioning and giving the talk and trainings to the parents. So, and he was the first example, he was fully recovered. So would that be possible to copy paste to the to the other populations who are suffering from those kind of social issues? Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks, Yujia. Yes, panel, anyone?
Well, it's definitely a really big challenge. And yes, one of the limitations of a lot of research is that there is a very big focus on autistic people who don't have intellectual disability. And I think once you have multiple conditions or multiple diagnoses, including intellectual disability and other kind of co-occurring conditions, it becomes much harder to know which of the difficulties that the individual faces are to do with autism versus to do with these other conditions. But certainly in terms of our the kind of perspective we put forward today, we would say, I think to some extent, the kinds of these kind of extreme behaviors that you're talking about that you might see in non-verbal autistic kids or adults are we don't necessarily understand why they are occurring, and that's the big challenge. So again, I think there's maybe that lack of it's hard for non-autistic people to make sense of those behaviors, and they may not seem like they have any purpose. So for example, the repetitive behaviors may not seem like they have any purpose, and certain interventions have been carried out to try and stop autistic people engaging in those behaviors. But again, they may actually serve some kind of anxiety reduction kind of purpose and things like that. So I think I'm not explaining this very well, but I think I would say that there's still part of the issues they're experiencing might be that other people can't understand their internal states very well, and they can't interpret their behavior very well either. And maybe if we could do this, we could create conditions whereby some of the distress and things like that might be reduced for those individuals. Whether or not all of them would be able to learn language or other kinds of skills might be very individual specific. But I think the aim should be, at least in those cases, to try and reduce distress and foster the environment that's most conducive to them having a comfortable life. But that's sort of my take on it. But I do think you're very right that there's a lack of research on those populations in general.
Thanks, Lizzy. There was one question just now in the chat. This is by Dr. Choi Soo-Kwin. Is there any latest research on ABA within the context of increasing voices of autistic individuals raising concerns on the rigidity and other issues? Anyone could comment on that?
I'm not really aware of the latest research. If anyone else has more knowledge about that, feel free to take the floor. I can say something about this, though. I mean, there's been quite some debate about applied behavioral analysis. I think since last year, maybe a bit earlier, that it was a very rigid approach where you force autistic people to, basically pretend to not be autistic. And I think we kind of, I mean, so I think we kind of now, and what we talked about today as well, is that we agree that that's not the goal of an intervention. The goal of an intervention should be, well, basically have a better quality of life, but also more understanding from the environment, improving family quality of life, and forcing autistic people to do certain things that are really uncomfortable with might not be the best approach. So there's definitely, an alternative needed there. But I do think with ABA, I think it's mostly, it originates in the United States and it was used a lot there. And I know there's a lot of ABA centers in Malaysia as well, but as far as I know, they have to adapt a little bit here in Malaysia because Malaysia is not the United States. And I think basically what you should do, there's not a one size fits all intervention for autism. So basically with any kind of intervention, what one should do is make sure that you align with what the person wants, what the parents want, what the family wants, what's possible at all, whether there's enough time for the support, what the most pressing needs are. So I think there should be, in any kind of intervention for autism, there should be a lot of attention to what's really needed for a certain person, and not be too rigid with respect to what you expect from someone.
Marieke, wonderful answer there. We've got 3 hands up, so let's address these 3 hands and then we'll call it a day. All right, first one, Lee Eyes One.
Hi, Lizzy and Peter. It's nice to see you, albeit virtually. My question's a very general one. With all this research being done, do you think it's an easy, straightforward process for practitioners to receive this knowledge and apply it accordingly? And also, is there a difference in this welcoming new ideas, this reception of new research in the UK and in Malaysia?
Shall I say something in answer to that, if that's okay? I think it's a really good question because it actually raises the question of how do, and this is a really sensitive subject actually, but it sort of raises the question of how do professionals perceive autistic people, and to what degree do professionals misperceive autistic people, and what's the attitude of professionals towards autistic people? And of course, these are very difficult and sensitive questions to ask. And if one were just to ask, if one were just to ask that question in a very kind of innocent way, then the answer might well be, well, I apply my professional judgment and I always behave in a very professional manner and I don't show any discrimination, etc., etc. That's kind of answer you might get. But what we don't know at this time is if we were to ask participants, including professionals, to rate their liking of other people and to interpret things about other people in a context where they don't know who it is that they're judging, they don't know if the person they're making a judgment about is or is not autistic, then the question is, do their judgments, do their negative perceptions and their misunderstandings effectively discriminate or predict which of those people are looking at is and is not autistic? Because it might do. And if it does, then, well, we need to do something about it. And I wouldn't blame those individuals. It's not, humans, you know, they're not perfect. People have all sorts of attitudes and prejudice, and you do your best to be professional, you do your best to act in good faith, but people aren't perfect, and they can get things wrong. And if that's the case, and if there are misjudgments and misperceptions among professionals about autistic people, then the first thing we need to do is to know about that so that we can give feedback, so that we can educate people to help them to improve. And one thing I'd add to that is that if we actually survey the views of autistic people in their experience of working with the professional health services, it's quite common for autistic people to say, well, I'm misunderstood. I went to see my doctor, but they didn't understand the issue I was trying to raise and how important it is and how serious it is. I just wasn't able to impress it upon them. So in answer to your question, nice one, well, I think it's a very important question, and I think there's a pressing need to do some research into how autistic people are perceived by professionals. And I think the reason why it's not been done in the past is because of lack of ideas on how one might how one might go about doing that. But I think we know how to do it now, and we could do it. So that would be my answer.
Okay. I think we've really gone over time. I know there's a question from Pao Dong in the chat. First one, I think for Malaysia, I don't know, Kartini, if you have got any answer, but from what I know, I think we'll still need to do a lot of research to answer that question on poor life outcomes. And then second one is on Simon Baron-Cohen's perspective taking, and then Dr. Damien Milton's double empathy problem. I think that can be a whole set of new forum, you think, Peter?
Well, of course, we should acknowledge expertise by experience, and it really is key in any research project to, I mean, it's common in a research project to have a steering group or a steering committee, some advisors on to give input to the research, what the issue should be, how one should go about doing that research. And if that didn't involve participants in the autism community, well, that would surely be a very, very big mistake.
Right, thanks. Okay, one last one, and we'll have to, end it, because, yeah,
Hello.
promise 1 hour. Eva?
Yeah,
Eva?
yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, actually my question is similar to the one that was just posted in the chat about adults with autism in Malaysia and how prevalent is the research currently, because from what I've known is a lot of research has been done on the younger population for children here in Malaysia for autism. But how about the adults? Like, what happens to them? Yeah, so that was something that I would like to find out.
Thanks very much. Good one.
I think I can give a relatively brief answer. Well, my PhD student, Keith Chi, he actually tried to study adults with autism in Malaysia, but it was also the pandemic hit, so that kind of messed things up as well. But it was quite difficult to, particularly to do that online and to find autistic adults in Malaysia. As the study with students already showed, I think there's many adults with autism who might not have a formal diagnosis. I don't know that from research, but I know that I've talked to people who said they think they might have autism, but they were never officially diagnosed. In the study we did with students, which are adults, young adults, that did show that among that group that said they might have autism or who had a formal diagnosis, that they had a lot more additional difficulties like depression, bipolar, well, a lot of psychological conditions compared to the students who said they didn't have autism. So I think that's an indication. This is not a diagnosed population, but that's an indication that actually they do encounter a lot more difficulties than those adults without autism.
All right, well, there you go. definitely tons more research needed. And those of you students out there, if you are looking for a project, ta-da! Yeah, and those of you who are not students, who would like to be students again, welcome to university life, where you can join any one of us and do your masters or PhDs, and add on to the literature. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this forum. Thank you very much, panel speakers, Professor Peter Mitchell, Dr. Marieke De Vries, Dr. Lizzy Sheppard, and Dr. Kartini Ilias. Thank you so much for your time. And to all the Muslims out there, Eid Mubarak, Selamat Hari Raya Aidilfitri. Hopefully you have a nice, safe one with your families. And all right, take care and bye-bye. All the best, everyone.